Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. I am your host today. I am Del Gines, the lead community development advisor of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. And I handle our small business and economic development work for our region. And for those that are not familiar with the Federal Reserve System, we are composed of 12 regional banks and the Board of Governors. And our primary function is to deal with monetary policy in the United States, as well as ensuring the safety and soundness of the payment systems, banking regulation, and other things. Our particular bank from the Kansas City Fed, the Kansas City Fed covers the 7 states, pretty much in the middle of the country. So we go from Kansas City West and cover Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, and part of New Mexico, pretty much from Albuquerque north. And so the purpose of regional banks is really so we can get a sense of what our region is, because we know all financial transactions don't happen on the East or the West Coast or in New York. And so we have a great president, Esther George, who really is a representative of our region when she goes and makes monetary policy decisions. So why are we here today? Besides the fact that I get to hang out with super cool panel, there's an economic reason for it. And so during the pandemic, I co-authored along with the Atlanta Fed, Federal Reserve Bank, a guide called the Small Business Owner's Guide to Recovery, with the idea that after the pandemic, we really want to work to build our entrepreneurship ecosystems to make them stronger than what they were before. We know that when you look at historical business data, that owners of color have dramatically lagged behind non-owners of color in the entrepreneurial space across multiple dimensions, from startups to scale-ups to business size and all of those other factors. And so our objective in writing the guide was to help communities understand ways that they can actually make their communities better for their entrepreneurs of color. And then along came something called the Racism in the Economy series that the Fed system put on as a whole, that many of you may be familiar with. And during this, which is an unprecedented event for the Fed, is we did a deep dive into the issues that faced individuals of color in this economy due to systemic racism. And I was fortunate enough to be able to co-lead the session on entrepreneurship. And one of the things that we found coming out of that was that we talked about systemic racism in the economic space, very general, in the entrepreneurship space, very general. But we know that different people of color groups experiences this differently. And one of the topics that we also found was underserved was that of our Native American brothers and sisters and the specific issues that they face. And this was driven home to me at the Winnebago tribe. We have a branch board member at the Omaha branch where I'm located at, who's from the Winnebago tribe, and she's the CEO of Ho Chunk Industries. And so we were able to go up to Ho Chunk and hang out with Lance Morgan, who runs that, their CEO. And I found out that we actually graduated from the same high school, Omaha North, and grew up actually about a mile away from each other, which is really wild to me. And this is about a $250 million company right now. And we were given a tour, really cool stuff. And we were talking to their CDFI up there and other folks. And he started to explain some of the challenges that they had in dealing with the various nuances of tribal sovereignty, of economic development on tribal lands. And so when I decided to do the first webinar that's dealing with a specific people's group, I thought, what better way to do it than do it with some of our Native American brothers and sisters to kind of really understand from their perspective what some of the challenges are of small business development on tribal lands, and some ways that the community as a whole and also us as the Federal Reserve can help them. And so with that, we're going to get right into it, because my former colleague at Creighton, Taylor Keene, has to leave us a little bit early, not because he doesn't like you, but because he has an exciting opportunity at the university that he has to get to. And so I just want to briefly read their bios, and then we'll get right into the conversation. So first up is Cindy Logsdon, the Director and Chief Executive Officer of Citizen Potawatomi Community Development Corporation. Cindy is the direct officer of the Potawatomi Development Corporation, and she oversees a staff of 7 focused on economic development and access to capital in Indian country. Then we have my former colleague at Creighton University, Taylor Keene, and he's the full-time instructor at Creighton in the College of Business Administration and Strategy and Entrepreneurship. He's also the founder of Sacred Seed, a non-profit entity whose mission is to propagate tribal seed sovereignty, battle for tribal sacred geography, and seek cultural revitalization among tribal peoples. And then we have Heather Sopropina, who's the project manager for the Center for Indian Country Development from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, who we're going to hear more about later in the program. And in there, she supports the prosperity of Native nations through actionable research, policy development, and community collaborations. And finally, on the panel, we have Vanessa Roanhorst, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Roanhorst Consulting. And it's an Indigenous women-led think tank that co-designs wealth and power building efforts that invest in thoughtful, community-led efforts that put people back in the center. I love that bio, by the way, Vanessa. That's pretty dope. So I would like to welcome you all to the panel today, and we're just going to have free-flowing conversation around the questions that we kind of set up for it. And by the way, for those of you who do have a question at the Q&A portion of it, please feel free to go down there and click the Q&A button and write your questions. And when you get to that question, I'll pop it up and we'll get to as many as we can. So for everybody, I guess the first question that we have is really around the issues of the general state of entrepreneurship on tribal lands. I don't know a lot about the subject, which is why I'm so excited to have the panel. And we know one of the things that I do know is that all tribes are different. Like there's not a homogeny amongst the tribes, but in general, from your respective perspectives, what is the state of entrepreneurship on tribal lands? Let's start with Vanessa, and then everybody else can fill in with their thoughts.
Thanks, Del. I appreciate it. And thanks for having me here. I mean, honestly, like as a small business owner and someone who had to start her own company, I personally had the chance to test it all out. But really, like what we're seeing in Indian country is that entrepreneurship isn't new. I mean, we are and have been entrepreneurial before this place was the United States of America. What has changed, though, is how and where we're able to define value and assets, meaning like what we're making and building align with the current commerce and economic systems of today. And so what has happened is because Native and Indigenous people in the United States, we have been so overlooked, marginalized, and historicalized in one, just understanding the history of this place, but also our representation. I mean, if you haven't been watching Reservation Dogs on Hulu, please do. Rutherford Falls, please do. But it's the fact that it's 2021 and we're finally seeing that representation really threads into why we don't see entrepreneurship at the level in which we see other communities that have also been marginalized at. One is population size, but two, the reason Native businesses and Native entrepreneurs do this work isn't really actually because of the same reasons that I think sort of this current system's value, which is oftentimes for Native Indigenous women, they're starting companies because it helps them have some agency over themselves, provides them some economic empowerment, but also they're starting companies to solve problems they see happening within their tribes, within their communities, their kids, their elders. And so when they're starting companies, they're not looking at it from a place of what is my high scale company going to look like so I can go get a venture capital backing to then eventually sell it. They're actually trying to create long-term solutions in places they live. Now, when we look at the systems of that, it also means we have to talk about land and how Indigenous people and communities like us have been denied access to build assets on our own ancestral and tribal lands, both on and off reservations. And so when you start to really kind of peel back this onion, where entrepreneurship has changed for us isn't that we're not entrepreneurial. It's that the current systems has ensured we're unable to build the kind of wealth and assets that aligns with our values, as well as being able to work with what place we live in. And I know the team here and the group is going to share so much more, but I just always have to set the stage, which is the context of the history of this country and the fact that Indigenous people have a different worldview. And our values around assets and wealth look absolutely different. So when we talk about capital and entrepreneurship and opportunity, it's a time for us to think about a different way to access those resources, but also how we support business and also the purpose of business, which isn't just to make money.
It's not? Are you sure? But great point. That's an excellent point. The distinction of values and the perception of entrepreneurship. Sometimes we get stuck in thinking that, shareholder max primacy, maximizing revenue is the only thing people think about entrepreneurship. And we know that for many cultures, and even dominant people in dominant culture, that's not true. Taylor, what are your thoughts? State of entrepreneurship on tribal lands.
Sure, thanks, Dale. I just wanted to echo some of the comments that Vanessa made. Just kind of colors the picture just a little bit more. I think it's really crucial to understand the structure of tribal economies. And this is going back to federal Indian policy from the late 1800s moving forward, but it's all relevant. First of all, you have the reservation system, which is held in trust by the United States on behalf of the individuals. So individual entrepreneurs, even though they may have received a family allotment on their reservation, it's not to be used as collateral because its status is trust status by the United States. So an individual cannot walk into a bank and say, I'd like to start a small business and use my land as collateral. So that is one thing that will always haunt entrepreneurship in Indian country. Having said that, we've seen a broad dispersal of tribal citizens from the reservation to urban areas. And I primarily speak from the perspective of the Omaha Nation, where probably 65 to 70% of us live in either Sioux City or Omaha or Lincoln. And so that has drastically changed. So access to education for entrepreneurship has become more and more critical. And I think one of the best vehicles for entrepreneurship education in the Indian country has been through our tribal college systems. And even though I've been an instructor in entrepreneurship for going on 15 years now, have yet had a formal opportunity to go up and help some of the entrepreneurs on the Omaha reservation. Having said that, I do know that the Nebraska Indian Community College is making great strides towards that. So access to capital is an entirely other issue. But going back to some of Vanessa's comments, it's not about maximizing the risk-adjusted shareholder return. It's often about building tribal nations and our capacity and our ability to solve our own problems. You brought up Ho-Chunk Inc. and the work of Lance Morgan and the team there. And I think everyone admires greatly what they've been able to do for themselves. The example that I always use, and I know all these companies have changed names, but they had an entity, basically it was called ResCars. And how that came about was they were trying to better understand absenteeism from some of their instrumentalities. And ultimately they figured out that some people weren't getting to work on time because they didn't have, reliable transportation. Well, they looked into that a little bit deeper and realized it was really about access to credit issues. And so they singled out a target population, worked with some banks to do credit counseling and got everybody up to the point where they wanted to be. And that was the start of ResCars. So you see a lot of innovation and creativity within tribal communities to solve communal problems. Thank you.
Great point. Cindy, what are your thoughts? State of entrepreneurship on tribal lands.
Well, thank you for having me today. I really appreciate that. I would say that although there are many barriers, as several other panelists have pointed out, to entrepreneurship, we're seeing an all-time high in a pipeline, and I'm speaking from the lending perspective. We've had probably our strongest year yet. And people are just getting innovative. Native Americans are getting innovative. We are purposely, I'm in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and part of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And, we're part of our tribal economy, and we see that what our part is in the tribal economy, and also what that means to access to capital and so forth. We've closed over $12 million in loans this year. Our norm's about 5. So, and all of that, and also that it may look different from where I'm at to where my peers that are located very rurally How is the infrastructure? Does the tribe have UCC codes? Do they have a court system? Are they able to use the Hearth Act to be able to do leasehold mortgages there on tribal land? So it's all the sophistication sometimes of the tribes. And do they have an economy? Do they even have the infrastructure there to be able to build upon in very rural settings? So we are seeing that across the board. There's 69 native CDFIs across the nation. And, we're uniquely positioned to know our clientele and be able to meet them exactly where they're at the moment.
That's phenomenal. That's a significant jump in loans in a given year. Heather, what are your thoughts especially coming at it from the Center for Indian Developed Country, where you're looking kind of boundary scanning the entire, nation of what's going on? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think just in terms of, Vanessa's points and Taylor's as well, in terms of different value systems and being even able to see Indian country businesses, that's been something that's pretty ambiguous up until somewhat recently. In June of this year, we actually did some commissioned research with Dick Todd, who is formerly with the Fed Reserve, as well as Elton Micharizzi, which he is with the University of Minnesota, and then Randy Akey, who is a tribal economist who we work with quite a bit. And so they did some longitudinal analysis on a couple of different business data sets, and were able to overlay it with geospatial information so that they could more accurately target the location of businesses on and off reservation. And so I think that, a big piece, just in terms of being able to see what the current state of entrepreneurship on reservations is, just to even be able to see the businesses in any sort of statistical way. And so, the problems that contribute to not being able to see that is, to Vanessa's point, there's different value systems about what a small business is and what its contribution is to a local economy, as well as small sample sizes, right? So, so those are, I think, some areas that the Center for Indian Country is trying to address by building larger data sets and building out a data hub, so that folks who want access to that kind of information or want to be able to see and quantify small business in Indian Country will start to be able to see that. I think that, we have lots of great one-off studies that look at either communities or regions or, certain sectors, such as gaming. But I think that being able to see the constellations and the universe of small business in Indian Country is just starting to come together as this generally, expensive information is being put together and housed and accessible, and also interpreted and analyzed by tribal economists. And so I think that that's a big piece of being able to see what the entrepreneurship state on reservations are. And I will say, an interesting point in this study is that on average, the location of a business on a reservation has been associated with higher business establishment survival rates than off reservation. And that, there's some seminal work that has come before this with Cornell and Kalt, really identifying what some of those determinants may be. And, to the extent that there is a match between the political environment or the political component of the reservations that also matches the cultural component of the reservations for business development, we see stronger resiliency in those businesses. And so in part, it is the lining up of the stars of those areas. So, I just think there's much more to come in this area in terms of research and data, and really being able to see what a small business looks like and maps out in Indian Country.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Data is a constant concern in all entrepreneurship space, especially real-time data. And I think especially from an equity perspective, the ability to have data on specific demographic groups, so we really even understand what's going on, I think is huge. So the next question, and I'm going to direct it to Taylor in deference to his time as a starting point, is we kind of circle around some of the particular challenges of and opportunities. I guess there is an opportunity of tribal entrepreneurship. We talked a little bit about sovereignty, the issues of values, that, you know, the kind of the issues of collateralization. So when we kind of start looking at, you know, what entrepreneurship is on the tribal lands and the structure of the governance of that process, both within the tribe and the tribe's interaction with the United States as a whole, what are some of the major challenges, but I'm also going to say opportunities, even though that wasn't in the initial question, because I think it may lend to both. What are some of the challenges and opportunities based upon tribal sovereignty and structures around entrepreneurship? We'll start with Taylor this time around.
Sure. Thanks, Dale. I think one of the things that most important to understand about tribal sovereignty and economic development is that the tribes enjoy broadly civil regulatory authority, which is kind of rooted in the legal battles for Indian gaming. But ultimately what it means is that tribal nations can assert civil regulatory authority, such as gaming, and regulate it, but it also can go to the sectors of insurance or healthcare, and it gets a little convoluted. But if tribal nations are doing it with their own tribal citizens on tribal land, then they can regulate those various new industries. And there hasn't been a ton of capacity, but ultimately tribal nations can act in a similar fashion to states in terms of regulations. You see down in Oklahoma, value added tax differences and how we do car tags, for example. And so the tribes have the opportunity to become more efficient than the states and to regulate things differently. It's also mentioned about nation building and capacity development of universal commercial codes, LLC acts. All these things can help better prepare Indian country for trade and commerce. Thank you.
Thanks. Our trusty back office said I was muted, and I asked the most profound question in the history of questions while I was on mute. But the question I was asking was actually directed towards Cindy as a CDFI, who's looking to put capital into the hands of entrepreneurs on tribal lands. And so you're probably experiencing some of the nuances and the distinctions between tribal entrepreneurship and non-tribal entrepreneurs. So what are kind of some of the benefits and challenges of tribal entrepreneurship from a sovereignty standpoint?
Well, some of the major challenges is that tribal members or citizens may not be quite trained up if they have no experience. Say we have a lot of, I've been a mechanic for 10 years. I want to buy, or, start my own business working for myself. They may not have necessarily the training it is to actually manage a business. So where the opportunity there is, hey, we can hold your hand. That's what CDFIs are here for. We are a lending source, of course, but we're more the hand holder. Let's get you some training. You're really strong in this area, but you don't know accounting. Let's get you some training. So that is huge. No down payment or equity to put into a project is really having that skin in the game sometimes is the maker or breaker to a small business. How much do they have to lose themselves? We don't have a minimum equity injection. We just want something. We want a business owner to show us that they've got, and then where does that come from? Do you go to friends and family, or, is it from your per cap? So that may be a challenge.
What's that? You said per cap?
Per cap. Some tribes, our tribe does not, but some tribes will divide up their profits and divide that up to each tribal member. A lot of times if they're underage, they will give them a lump sum when they turn X, 18 or 21 years old. There again, it comes to education. What does a tribal member have in their toolbox to go, hey, this is an opportunity for me to save. This is an opportunity, if I'm not saving every month, but I can save when I have a windfall. It's training our youth that when you turn 18 or 21, you're going to have X amount, have something to show for it. Just don't go blow it. So, we have opportunity, but a lot of that, it's rooted in financial education and business education.
And you mentioned something about skin in the game. And this takes me back to one of the original comments by Taylor, where he talked about the challenges of collateralization, land as collateralization on tribal lands. Does that come into play when you're trying to lend, the inability to collateralize?
Sometimes it does. It really does. We have several housing loans that are on trust land. We're able to exercise the Hearth Act leasehold mortgage in that case. We also have businesses on tribal land, where as long as we can get BIA on board to file and those sorts of things, and a lot of times there's a big delay, right?
I think, and I'm going to do this to everybody, not just you, Cindy, because we have probably a brand new audience. What is BIA?
It is the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Okay.
And they are the managers of tribal lands.
Gotcha. And by trust, it means that the land is held by the tribe and not by the individual. Am I correct in that?
It is held in trust for the individual or for the tribe.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. And sorry if I have to stop you all, because I'm new to this too. And this is why I'm so excited to do it. So I'm assuming probably a lot of our audiences are learners too. So Heather, your take on it, the tribal lands, sovereignty, the opportunities and the challenges for entrepreneurship based upon that, the tribal sovereign framework.
Sure. So, I would say yes to everything that's been said so far in terms of land status and the ability to collateralize. I think that there's a delicate balance between saying that, this is a challenge, particularly for financial institutions to come in and lend on reservations, or to make loans on tribal trust property or federal trust property. But that doesn't. That's not a pass, right? That doesn't mean that commercial lenders shouldn't come in and try to figure out a way to actually be able to collateralize or to come up with workarounds. And so, I think that in terms of risk mitigation, which is what a lot of financial institutions base their lending off of, I think that there's a lot of opportunity for less risk averse or organizations that have a higher capacity to absorb some of that risk to come in and act as that collateral partner. We have good examples of this happening in Montana, where we have a program called the Native American Collateral Support Program that comes in and actually acts as the collateral or holds the equity in the form of certificates of deposit for commercial loans, instead of that individual having to collateralize land, which makes it more difficult. And so it not only speeds up the process, because we know that that process can be somewhat slow. It also helps facilitate the banks are less risk averse to do that because they have this this loan that's been collateralized and it meets their lending requirements. And I would say a lot of times we have smaller banks that are lending in Indian country for some of these deals. And so that's something that they have to watch real carefully. I will also say that, just in terms of risk tolerance, there's no reason why state programs couldn't come in, or community development programs to come in and act as that partner. I have some more thoughts, but I'll wait to share them later in some of the other questions. So thanks.
Yeah, Vanessa, and you know, Vanessa, with your work with Indigenous women and the issues of sovereignty, entrepreneurship, you know, kind of what are you seeing in that space? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges of that kind of autonomy, and then also the things that come with it?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I'm so grateful because like for everything everyone has shared, the thing is like, we need more products. We need more organizations, institutions willing to take on some of the risk. And part of what we're seeing, so right now with like Native Women Lead, which is another organization I get to be a part of, you know, we started this because we saw 2/3 of our women are actually the breadwinners nationally. And at least half of them are living on tribal lands. They make 60 cents to the dollar, 4 in 5 will experience extreme violence. Yet in the last 20 years, Native Indigenous women have been launching business 2 times than our white female counterparts. Yet they don't have the actual resources, the networks, or the safety nets. I think what's interesting about the Ho-Chunk example is like they are kind of the gold star as for like how they were able to be really innovative and utilize their sovereignty, their tribal leadership government structure, and their enterprise to create localized systems for their small business entrepreneurs. However, there's so many other challenges and barriers that can be faced, but I think these are opportunities for our other tribal nations. And when I think about the capital piece and how and why we're doing this work at Native Women Lead and at Roan Horse Consulting, what we have found is that because our network and our entrepreneurs and our women move seamlessly across tribal, rural, and urban landscapes, partially to find work, partially because of where resources are, partially because sometimes they're caring for their elders back home, but they're living in an urban space because that's where the work is, or where that's where their business can thrive. That they didn't have the risk profile or the credit or the 5 C's that were able to get them into the room to even apply appropriately. And so what we're really excited about is like, as everyone is building these systems and these programs, it's that like, how can we create more products that represent what the community is looking for, particularly at that friends and family round we talk all the time about for communities of color. It's absolutely the same thing for us. However, this idea that people are interested in equity financing or are interested in venture capital isn't true for Indian country. It's just, there's a tiny, tiny percentage that's possible. But the rest are what I would like to consider, and this is something my colleague at Change Labs, Jessica Stego, says, is like, what is the baseline entrepreneur economy looking for on our tribal lands and then off tribal lands? And that's anywhere between 5 to 50,000 starting. You know, we're seeing that consistently, whether it's for startup, stabilization capital. And so our interest on our side is like, how do we create character-based lending, meaning not using some of the traditional 5 C's for any of our measurement process as part of our reciprocity and reparations framework we believe in at Native Women Lead, to sort of help de-risk the money, not only for the investors, the funders, and those putting the debt capital in, but also on our side, coming up and saying, we're going to help do this by creating a collateralization process with private funder philanthropic dollars. And a lot of people are like, well, how do you make money off of that? And I'm like, we're not trying to make money. What we're trying to show is that those who look the most risky on paper, it's because we're valuing and putting risk judgments on them that don't fit what it is they're doing. And if we're working with Indigenous women entrepreneurs, I mean, they're the hardest working women who are ensuring kids are cared for. They're getting to their medical appointments. They're getting good food. Education's being met. The data is there globally that when you put money into the hands of women, they will give it back to the community and they will reinvest it locally. So the idea is like, what if we were to do that, but recognize that the entrepreneur isn't just a financial challenge. There's a whole social world around them that has to also be recognized and managed. So for me, it's just like, how do all of these products fit? And how do we help our entrepreneurs access the right type of product that fits where they are, so they can then eventually grow into the next one or into a next partnership. And I think that's the opportunity. Indian countries, while we are small, we are highly connected, and we are absolutely trying to figure out how do we work across organizations and learn from each other's successes. Yeah, so, you know, there's so many ways to tackle this.
That's great, and so you kind of teed up the question. You kind of teed up the next question on access to credit and capital. So let's move to Heather on that one. You know, obviously you're with us. You're with the family of the FET family, right? And so a lot of what we do is think about issues of access to credit and capital, and the general state of the economy, banking, et cetera. So when we look at access to credit and capital on tribal lands, kind of what are you seeing? What are you seeing are the kind of the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities for improvement with access to capital for tribal entrepreneurs?
Sure. So, you know, I think even just addressing our role at the Federal Reserve as a regulator of the Community Reinvestment Act is a huge opportunity that we have to start to address really the hindered flow of capital into Indian country for small businesses. And just even the presence of financial institutions in Indian country is something that needs to be addressed. So for example, Indian country is largely geographically separated or segregated from mainstream financial institutions. On average, you have 26 bank branches per county across the US. For non-metro counties, you have an average of 9 bank branches. For majority Native American counties, they have an average of 3 bank branches. And so what ends up happening is that you have a smaller volume of banks in Indian country that can make these types of loans or create this access to capital for small businesses. And from the regulatory side of that, there is CRA, which is called the Community Reinvestment Act, which is currently undergoing a modernization by 3 regulators to come together to update it. I think the last time was 25 years ago. The financial industry holds itself to certain standards of not redlining and making sure that there's that there's retail lending and services provided at their branches and at their banks. And then the other piece of that is there's a community development test for some of the larger banks. Well, what ends up happening is that three of every 4 bank branches in the rural parts of the United States, which would also cover the majority of Native American counties, are considered small, categorized small. So they're not subjected to a community development test under the Community Reinvestment Act. And when you incentivize banks to do community development or financial institutions to do community development, that money then flows out into communities to address social goods such as small business entrepreneurship. And so I think we're missing a big critical link in the chain of increasing that flow of funding into smaller Native communities. And so increasing access to financial services is a huge area that I think that we can make some strides in the Community Reinvestment Act. So that's definitely, one piece that I think that the Federal Reserve, along with other regulators, can do to really extend that flow of credit in Indian country, and to invest in community development organizations and Native CDFIs to do that heavy lift locally.
Because you are a lender and you are a CDFI, Cindy, I kind of saved you as the last individual on this particular question, because you're doing this on a daily basis and you're seeing some of the challenges from the demand side and what people need to do to get a loan. But talk in general about that access to credit and capital as a whole when dealing with tribal entrepreneurship. You're on mute now too.
Thank you.
There you go.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there, and that's demand. There is more demand out there than there is to go around. And a lot of federal agencies get native CDFIs. We have to have access to capital for it to flow down and get it working right out in our communities. But I would say too, on the CRA side, that banks don't understand CDFIs. We will present a package to a bank and they're going, what's a CDFI? So I think there's a real challenge on the space that I work, because large banks understand. They usually have as foundation side of the house that invests greatly into native CDFIs or CDFIs in general. But if you're a local bank, or you're not even aware of the Bank Enterprise Award, that kind of goes hand in hand with the CRA, that if a bank invests in a CDFI, they can get basically a rebate back from the CDFI fund. Even with incentives like that in place, we're not seeing the investment going into CDFIs as it should be, where we're really, we're the hand holders, we're the ones that can basically bring that entrepreneur to a space where they're ready for a loan.
And this wasn't on our list of questions, but it kind of dovetails with it, because I know, Vanessa, you talked about friends, family. We have another F, fools, that we learned in banking when I used to be a banker, that usually serve as the early stage investors. And then we talked a little bit about, the general credit challenges, from microloans to, more scalable debt. We haven't really talked about the equity space, angel venture. And I know I didn't tee this up, so if nobody really has a thought on it, that's perfectly fine. But it just came to me that if anybody has an answer, what is going on in angel and venture on tribal lands or with tribal entrepreneurs, if anything? I'll open that up to the floor.
I would, so in terms of angel investing, and in terms of, let's just do angel investing, because they're not the same as venture capital.
Right.
I think the work that has to be done is really on the investor education side. So as angel investors are really trying to get excited, they want to see Indigenous entrepreneurs, in front of them. They want to see what they're doing. The challenge is we're still coming from this traditional idea on what's like a high growth scalable company, and what kind of sectors should we be putting our money into, what's going to have the greatest return, versus what we're seeing that we're trying to help. So we actually have 4 different companies right now in front of some angel investors. But we had to do a ton of investor education on why these types of businesses aren't going to look like the regular other portfolio you might be used to seeing. And then we also had to help in terms of even just some of this education on sovereignty and how land and values are actually different. And so part of it is just, one, finding Indigenous entrepreneurs who are down for this level of criticism. This is this is a totally different game. The other is whether or not our entrepreneurs really want to give up any decision making. Let's just be real. As Native people, we are so used to having people tell us, we can help you, just got to give up a little bit of power. And that's not worked out for us. So the idea of is the angel investment the right place? I think it can be. But the work is really on the investor side, in my opinion, not the business and entrepreneurial side. Those who are actually ready for that kind of capital are way more savvy, way more thoughtful, but they're also not down to give up any of their equity, which takes me to venture capital. And I'm not going to probably be the most popular person on this. I don't think venture capital is the model that really we should be putting time and energy into. It is a whole system that doesn't live in the real world, because they don't even use the 5 C's of credit themselves. They don't have to. It's about relationships. And then who gets to decide to get access to that capital is going to be determined by a very small percentage of people who don't look like us and don't have our lived experience. The final piece for me is, as all of these new Bypoc funds are being created, which is awesome, And they're looking at equity-like financing. They're looking at more innovative, share models or whatever it is they're trying to use. The reality of it is they still haven't done the work to develop relationships in Indian country, so they can't find the I in the BIPOC. So my interest is, put the money into organizations that are already building that relationship, that are already having those conversations and are working alongside those businesses because they know what they need. And let's be honest, we need a plurality of products to reach the goals we're trying to get to, which is more opportunity and more patient capital that allows people to grow and fail and keep growing.
And for folks that don't know, BIPOC means Black, Indigenous, people of color. So when she says you can't find the I, she's saying the I is Indigenous. So just to unpack that acronyms. And I'll tell you, I did not know what that meant until about a month ago either. I was like, why do people keep saying BIPOC? And then somebody said, oh, this is what it means. I'm like, okay, got it. So now we're going to kind of pivot the conversation more towards what can be done from either a community, a organizational or national level to support it. And so let's turn to Heather first. And let's start with the question, what are the most important things that tribes can do to support entrepreneurship on tribal lands?
Sure. And I think some of this has already been mentioned, in previous comments, having really robust Model Secure Transaction Act, Uniform Commercial Code, lien filing systems, really looking at that legal financial infrastructure and developing that legal financial infrastructure, and particularly, for loan products or programs that are going to require those kinds of systems, I think are really important. Just thinking holistically, what do our communities, not only what do our tribal enterprises need to be able to access this kind of funding, but also what does our private sector need to be able to access this kind of funding.
Heather, quick question. I don't mean to cut you off, but I do have a quick question to unpack that a little bit. So when you say like things like UCC filing systems, et cetera, does each tribe need to set up their own structure for that particular process or some of those processes?
I think that this is actually where there's a perfect opportunity for tribes and states or local governments to work together in a collaborative way. We have an example here in Montana in terms of the lien filing system where the Crow tribe signed a historic agreement with the Montana Secretary of State's office to perfect security lien interest through the state's lien filing system. And so I think that we potentially will see that in the state of Oklahoma as the 5 civilized tribes really start to flex their civil regulatory muscles in terms of what services and what kind of licensing they can complete or perform on behalf of small businesses within their territorial boundaries. And so I think that, that's an exciting development that we will see unfold. And so, yes, I think that, a huge opportunity for tribes to support their private sector as well as their tribal enterprises is to really take in hand the legal financial infrastructure that creates those pathways of access to capital, of recognition, of revenue generation for the tribe to be able to provide these services to their tribes. I will say the other thing that I think is a huge investment that tribes can make is also in broadband. And there's some pretty staggering statistics that and analysis that came out of the Federal Reserve just in terms of the accessibility of broadband. So, there's a 20 percentage point difference between households on tribal lands that have internet versus those on non-tribal areas. And then of that, there's the caveat that tribal households are twice as likely to access the internet exclusively through smartphones than other households located in similar neighboring non-tribal areas. There's also, the latency issue. So upload download speeds are 30% slower on fixed devices in Indian country than in non-tribal areas. And basic broadband plans are more expensive. So they're 14 to 17% more expensive for your basic broadband compared with nearby non-tribal areas. So I think that, you know, fixing the technology infrastructure, the broadband infrastructure, and the legal financial infrastructure are huge pieces that tribal governments could make those investments into and see, you know, really great returns and outcomes for their private sector.
What are your thoughts on that, Cindy? What can tribal governments, you know, do to better support entrepreneurship?
Well, that's one thing I had on my list as well as infrastructure. And that could be the several pieces that Heather just mentioned. It can be as simple as roads, having a road that is paved and you know, just makes it accessible, or you're putting businesses somewhere along roadways, or it could be just access to that. I also had the use of the pandemic funds. There's a real opportunity there that tribes can be supporting their own tribal businesses, and they can be also supporting tribal members' businesses. There is an opportunity right now with the SSBCI money that's flowing down through tribes. We are partnering with our tribe here, and we haven't seen the final regs on that, but we do know that we will at least get a portion of that to lend out. And, you know, I would even like to see maybe an equity portion, you know, that might be get innovative on if there is a lack, partner with BIA guarantees, you know, have a capital stack that really sets up a business owner in the manner that they should be set up, and, you know, with working capital, with those enough collateral. But I think that with these pandemic dollars, that's a really, really good way that tribal or tribes can get involved with their citizens.
And just as an FYI, I will be sending out to all registrants information on SSBCI funding for tribes in the post follow-up. I promised the Center for Indian Development Country, I make sure that we got that into your hands. I know that there is a timeline.
Did they extend the LOI? Did they extend that LOI? Is it till October?
I'm not
That's
100%.
like
I'm not 100%
okay.
sure. I don't know if Cindy knows, but we'll pack all that information up, and we'll make sure that we get it out to the registrants, because that is a potentially really big deal. And for those that don't know, the SSBI funding is a allocated pool of funding that can be drawn down on by states and tribes and allocated towards the support of entrepreneurship at the local level. So it's a pretty big deal, but I'll make sure that I get that in everybody's hands that registered. Vanessa, you want to tackle that that question as well on opportunities for tribes to support entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I'm going to come from it a different way, because these ladies are experts. And from my side, I'm more on the practitioner on the ground. I think what's really important is that, like, our tribes start to really think about that micro lending, credit enhancement, and really investing and helping folks who have not been traditionally bankable be able to get back into a place where they can bank. And what I mean by that is a lot of tribes are really looking at the larger tribal enterprises. They're looking at bigger types of business, but it's the baseline day-to-day small mom and pop shop economy on our tribal lands that are often overlooked, underinvested in. And we're asking them to still go after traditional types of lending products that just aren't going to meet them. They are not going to meet the day-to-day needs that they're looking for because of a whole plethora of reasons I won't even start to tackle. But what I wonder is, like, what can our tribes do? I think the pandemic, having different types of resources, how different tribes decided what to do with that money, is an example of, like, what does forgiveness look like? What are stronger incentives around creating, like, the kind of debt capital that is collateralized, that is added with guarantees, but also really is more interested in like, are you building a strong business? If you are, and you're meeting and you're tapping into these networks and resources, forgive it. You know, like at the end of the day, if we have more small companies who stay on our tribal lands or stay where they are, and they can employ themselves, that's a win. If they can employ someone else, now we're really starting to get somewhere, because most of our Native entrepreneurs in the United States are solopreneurs, meaning they have no employees. And so what is the goal? One is keep them going, keep them alive, and then let's help them get an employee. Let's help them build their wealth and expand their assets. But I think tribes can do that. But it's a different way of thinking, and it's a different kind of service.
And then kind of the question, and I started, you know, asking this and ensuring that I ask this in almost everything that I do, because we are the Federal Reserve, and the opportunity for individuals to tell us what they think we can do as an institution to help, particularly in this instance, develop entrepreneurship on tribal lands. And so I'm actually going to turn to Heather first and see if we can get her in trouble by asking her what the Fed can do. I'm just playing, Heather, but yeah, I want to start with you, because you are internal to it, and you've had conversations with a massive amount of external stakeholders, and you also know our inner working. So from your perspective, and you already talked a little bit about this before, what do you think we could do to better help spur entrepreneurship development on tribal lands?
I think that we have a great ability to be a broker of information between communities, right? In our community engagement work with and tribal leaders and decision makers at that level, with policymakers at the federal level and at the executive level, and you know, and the state level. So I feel like we exist in this nonpartisan space where we're a convener of these different types of interests and groups, you know, and really looking for financial inclusion for all. So I think that, you know, making sure that we are listening to our community partners and to the tribes, and not just you know, giving them an ear, but not giving a platform or not making a seat at the table for some of these issues to rise up, would be a big misstep on our part. And so I think that, you know, for us and for the work that I do, and having come from a real like tactical, programmatic type of work, before I came to the Federal Reserve, I just know that the implementation of ideas really becomes successful when we're really truly listening in our communities. So I think that, you know, readjusting how we think about you know, the financial health of our economies and of our country, to make sure that it's inclusive, is a big step for us. And then I would say, you know, just practically in terms of what the Fed Reserve can do, you know, we're the bankers bank, and so we're regulators, and so we regulate the banks, and so we can use that relationship to help incentivize, you know, deeper relationships or convenings or interactions with communities and larger concerns across tribes, and our you know, sister organizations out there. But I also think that, you know, the financial map in Indian country, whether it's because of a mismatch of values between a traditional Western financial system in Indian country, or the diversity in Indian country, or you know, a mismatch in what economists think is what we should be measuring versus what's measured in Indian country, is really a place where, you know, particularly the Center for Indian Country Development within the Fed Reserve can have a big impact, right? Because we're brokering that information, and we're looking at the data, and we're analyzing it, and we're gathering it, and we're making sure that, you know, we're reflecting lived experiences back across Indian country. So I would say, research is a huge thing that we can do, and our ability to convene and to get people to the table, to have these kinds of conversations, and with the right people, is a huge opportunity for the Center for Indian Country Development and for the Federal Reserve specifically. So, or more generally.
Outstanding. And you didn't even get in trouble, see? So that's great. And I love the point that you raised about, what economists look at, versus kind of some other alternative data sets that kind of really are real and are influential in people's lives. I think that's an important one. And of course, coming from the Fed too, that the power of research, the ability to have the technical expertise and the care and concern enough to be able to explore some of these issues from diverse populations, I think is a huge thing for us. And so I really appreciate what you all are doing at the center. Cindy, what's your take on that? What can we do to better help tribal entrepreneurship?
I'm in total agreement with Heather. I had written down the networking and what you guys bring in those situations. Continue to do that. Bringing all the native CDFIs in your state together. Wow, that is impactful. Whenever we can sit around the table, and sometimes it takes some influence, and is much appreciated. Being that matchmaker, whenever you see two individuals that you need to meet this person, that's invaluable. We've had that within the state of Oklahoma, just by having the right person in that job there at the Fed, that they're able to be that matchmaker, and it's much appreciated. And if you find out funding that opportunities, same thing, match us up to, gosh, this sounds a lot like, you have a funder or investor that isn't interested in Indian country, in the state of Oklahoma. Oh, I know somebody. That is invaluable and is much appreciated what the Fed does for this industry.
Outstanding. And Vanessa, I'll let you close us out on this question. What can we do to help entrepreneurship on tribal lands?
I think everyone is doing some of the most incredible work on the ground. And I think there's so many organizations that are pushing the thresholds of experimentation. They're trying things, they're failing. I think what would be amazing is to have organizations like the Fed, particularly, to be able to do some of that heavy lift on doing the education for those who have the resources, who have the policy, who can write the legislation, to help them understand the nuance and what's really going on. I think the ability to leverage the data that Heather and her team collect and how they utilize it is important. And I really do believe that the data is helpful, as long as it's aligned, though, with the realities of what's happening, and it isn't just coming from a top-down sort of understanding of research and data, but it's highly localized and nuanced to the work that's happening. I think the Fed is in a great position to not only convene and do the matchmaking, but ultimately help us create opportunities within the federal system to innovate. How can we create better funds? How can we design funds that are willing to do character-based funding? How do we look at those bridges between some of the departments within BIA to USDA and SBA? Some of those is just that the work is so big. And as we continue to push on what we're seeing happening on the ground, and that conversation has to permeate up to leadership, it's like, can the Fed help us with that education? Can the Fed use its resources to block and tackle? Because we don't want to slow the groups on the ground. We don't want to stop the work of the CDFI movement and what they need. They are better served doing the work than spending all of their time chasing that stuff. So I'm always thinking about that. It's like, how are we really shifting capital will shift power?
Great points, great points. And before we pivot to Casey to kind of give us a little bit deeper dive into Center for Indian Development Country, there was one question that came through in the panel about the utilization of ICDBG funds, Indian Community Development Block Grant Funds for economic development, small business support. Are any of you using those, or have you had experience or seen them used, or recommendations on how tribes could use those to support entrepreneurship? I'll just throw that open to the table. Cindy?
We've actually had 4 ICDBG awards to date. We have to apply through our tribe, and it's a pass through to the CDFI. If they get a backlog in ICDBG projects, usually that's to, build a building or something like that. They'll allow us to apply about every 3 to 4 years. And it's because of our tribal structure. We are incorporated under our tribe. And basically we're able to use that as micro enterprisal funds. It has to be to businesses that are low income, under 5 employees, including the business owner. And there's operating dollars that come with that. So the tribe usually gives me the matching funds, gives me the leverage. And it's a wonderful program. If anybody has any questions on how they may be able to utilize that through their tribe, just let me know.
That's great. Well, Heather, Cindy, and Vanessa, I truly appreciate this. And Taylor, even though he's off, hopefully getting great news from the university right now. This is a phenomenal conversation, and I think it just scratches the surface. I think more of the public needs to hear this. And with that, I do want to turn it over to Casey, and just a little introduction of Casey. So Casey is the Vice President and Director of the Center for Indian Development Country. And so he's responsible for leading all aspects of the work of the country. And in this role, he helps identify research and policy priorities and to increase the visibility and the impact and relevance of the center. And one thing that is great is we just got notified that Casey won our Yellen Award for Community Development in the System, which is an award that was started a couple years ago to celebrate outstanding achievements in community development. So we're really excited about that and the work that he's doing through the center. And so I want to give him a few minutes to kind of just introduce everyone to the center, kind of, what it is, what it's doing, and just share any general thoughts. And Casey, feel free if you want to share any additional thoughts on the any of the conversations that we had on the panel today as well.
Thanks, Del, and appreciate the opportunity to be able to share more about the Center for Indian Country Development at the Federal Reserve. And maybe before I dive into that, it was a wonderful conversation that each of the panelists contributed to. I think a couple of the takeaways for me is really what a lot of people don't think about is the different motivations for Native entrepreneurs of why they want to be an entrepreneur, like what do they want to contribute, how they want to contribute to their communities. And it's so in many cases just against the grain of how other folks outside of Indian country think about business development, think about goods and services in their communities. And I come from that work. I've been worked with Native entrepreneurs for a number of years, but I'm from the Flathead Reservation in Western Montana, and my dad owns a business. He still does, and I don't think he makes much money. I actually don't know if he knows what he makes, but he does know that he employs 14 family members, and he's been doing that for 42 years, and that it truly is his motivation, and I think that's not uncommon in our tribal communities. So I think that is important for the attendees to know. It's not your typical entrepreneurial setting, and certainly not your typical entrepreneurial ecosystem in which many of our Native entrepreneurs live in and work in and try to move forward. And just a couple other things, just as a segue into who we are as a center. A few of the key things that I heard in the discussion was economic ecosystem, economic infrastructure, the investments both from lending institutions, investments from tribal governments, certainly the importance of the private sector and just community well-being, as well as certainly this conversation that's certainly omnipresent in Indian country, and that being access to capital. And that has to be unpacked. I'm sure every panelist could have talked for hours and hours on issues around and opportunities around sort of affordable credit and affordable access to financial services. And that is something that is sort of front and center for the Federal Reserve, front and center for the Center for Indian Country Development. So just a couple thoughts, just an incredible presentation and panel and back and forth. So the question, that Del asked me to kind of cover is what is the Center for Indian Country Development? And, just to, the most basic terms, we are a research and policy institute it's headquartered at the Minneapolis Fed, but it's a part of the Federal Reserve System in the sense that we work with tribes and all around the country and policymakers and economic researchers to really advance Native American economic outcomes. And we do that in a few ways that have already been discussed. So through sort of high quality applied research, through coalition building and network building, and sort of really leveraging our clout in our stature as the Federal Reserve to bring people together and to bring ideas together. And often we're bringing folks together to talk about policy, talk about research and data and how that might inform or be instructive to policy development that really advances economic development in Indian countries. So our real goal is to leverage research and relationships to unlock the full economic potential that exists in Indian country. So we kind of live in this space at that sort of intersection of research, community engagement, convening, and policy dialogue. We've been around formally for a short period, 6 years now. And in the 6 years, we've been able to sort of build our sort of internal capacity, our administrative capacity. So we have a team, including Heather, of just wickedly talented people who are from Indian country or have worked in Indian country that are policy analysts, program managers, that are economic researchers or economists or research assistants that are really looking at data that might inform policy solutions. We've got a couple research fellows that we work with on applied research. We're hoping to bring on a legal fellow. Just due to the complexity of economic development always kind of hinges on a really complex federal Indian law. We have a whole host of commissioned researchers from all around the country that partner with us on research that are important to sort of the economic infrastructure in Indian country. And then we're really led by and driven by the perspectives of a leadership council. So Native experts from all around the country. We have 12 leadership council members that sort of represent different geographies and areas of expertise that are just so valuable for us to guide our work and as a resource to have that connection to their body of work, but a connection to their tribal communities as well. We've had a track record of working in Indian country at the Minneapolis Fed and at other reserve banks for decades, doing some work around, Heather mentioned, the Community Reinvestment Act and tribal legal infrastructure work, certainly some system research. We have a pretty a large portfolio, and it's becoming more of a legacy portfolio for us on tribal housing and home ownership. We've worked with partners to develop a Tribal Leaders Handbook on home ownership, which is really key for tribal policymakers and federal policymakers to understand that home ownership space, which is so important to our communities. And just in the past few years, past couple years, we're really kind of fine tuning sort of our focus areas, and it really kind of comes down to your question, Del, about you had a question about what can tribal governments do to support their economies or support their entrepreneurs. And the centers now really focusing on thinking about tribal long-term economic prosperity. So thinking about long-term economic impacts by doing research and convening and policy work to help tribal governments be positioned to provide sort of the public goods that support, the economic prosperity that they envision. So that really has us, more recently focusing on ways in which tribal governments can generate sort of robust and stable revenues that they can invest in their tribal and invest in their economic infrastructure. And so, kind of what that means in non-Fed speak is, doing research on sort of the role of tribal enterprises, tribally owned enterprises, and their role in generating revenues that then can be used by tribal governments to invest in their economic infrastructure. Things like, broadband and water and sewer and roads and all those things that are really needed for that robust and healthy private sector. We've hosted recently, back in July, a policy webinar on tribal enterprises. A lot of that conversation was really around diversification and additional data that's needed, and we'll continue to do that work. And then thinking about the role of government in general in providing sort of the space, the ecosystem for entrepreneurial success, that has to be funded some way. And in addition to the funding that comes from many of the tribal enterprises, we're looking at sort of ways in which tribes can really optimize their tax authority. So tribes have never receded their taxing authority, and that's a way in which governments really fund infrastructure. And so we've really started to do work around understanding tribal state compacts, the impacts of dual taxation in Indian country. Certainly watching the work of Treasury's Tribal Advisory Council on taxation. And in fact, next week, I'll put in a plug. The center is hosting a webinar on dual taxation. And we have some just great Indian country experts who are going to be speaking, and tribal policymakers and federal policymakers will be in attendance. So maybe we can send some information out about that. And I'd say maybe kind of the last area where we do a lot of focus is just understanding the efficacy of programming, particularly financing and tax credit programming that is available to Indian country. So thinking about the New Markets Tax Credit Program, thinking about LIHTC programming, thinking about tax-exempt bond financing in Indian country, and doing sort of research in the space that will inform policymakers about ways in which they can improve those so that they can really truly be tapped in Indian country. There's just a lack of penetration of those programs, of which those programs really are kind of bread and butter of larger investments into the public goods and communities, and in this case, in tribal communities. So we do kind of this robust body of work around Indian country on that ways in which we can support that long-term economic prosperity in Indian country, to bring people together, to make sure that Indian country has access to affordable capital, has the public goods to be able to have more resilient economies. And certainly that's something we all know and experienced over the past 18 months with the pandemic, is Indian country was hit really hard. Our private sector was, our small businesses were hit hard, tribal enterprises were hit hard. And a lot of that has to do with some deficiency in economic infrastructure that we know Indian country is really, really excited about making those big long-term improvements, particularly as Cindy mentioned, this historic level of funding that's in Indian country now just really creates this opportunity for tribal economies to thrive, to be stable, and to be places in which our entrepreneurs can really truly thrive. So I guess the last thing I would say, Del, is there's a whole lot of work that we're doing in that convening space and in the research space, and I'd invite folks to go to our website to learn a little bit more. And that's, we can put it in, I can drop it in here, but it's www.minneapolisfed.org.
We got it, Casey.
Oh, you got it? Okay,
We got
perfect. So it's an exciting asset that we have in a very complex institution that has a voice, and we want to make sure that Indian Country has a voice at the table as well.
Thanks, Casey. I appreciate that. And, you know, as I close out, I just want to express my gracious appreciation to all the panelists. You know, I didn't pay you to do this. You gave up your time graciously, and you can tell by just the tone of the conversation, your passion for it, and your commitment to the issues, both as a professional and also from community. I think this goes back to Vanessa's comments on values early on, and how, you know, a lot of our diverse communities don't do things necessarily for monetary gain, but for the good of the collective. And I think your time commitment to this process all the way through, even from the planning side, I just want to express the gratitude to the Federal Reserve for doing this. And I'm absolutely proud to be able to amplify the voice of our Indigenous brothers and sisters in the entrepreneurship with them. And I guess I kind of want to close on this, more of my editorial comments, like, you know, I have something that I call, you know, the concept of empathetic development. And within the ecosystem work that we do, and I'll put a link to the Fed, the KC Feds page, where we, you know, I do the ecosystem work. You can access the Small Business Owners of Color Recovery Guide. But I think one of the most essential things, and it came out and it was interwoven through, you know, this conversation, is that for us to really effectively do development work, we need to understand and learn and know about and listen to the people that we're trying to support. We're long past the days of just thinking that a certain few technical experts can come in and save the world. It's proven that it's not going to work. And the reason why this particular conversation was so important for me to have, and for it to be first up on our webinar agenda, is because I didn't know anything about it. And I didn't know about any of the nuances or even the basics of sovereignty, the issues and I've been doing entrepreneurship literally since my 20. I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but I've been doing it for over 2 decades in both the economic development world and also direct work with entrepreneurs. And as you heard, you know, me and Taylor were co-entrepreneurial professors at Creighton University, and I did not know any of this. And so if somebody who's as immersed in the space as I am don't understand it or don't know it, I have to assume that a large body of people across the United States don't as well. And I think it's important to know, if we do want to continue to make the economy, or we want to make the economy effective for all. And I think it's important for us to care. I think it's important for us to listen. And so I'm proud of the work that the Federal Reserve Bank has undertaken in the Racism in the Economy series, which is unprecedented, to really kind of take a broader look and recognize and acknowledge that certain forms of discrimination over the history of the United States has led to inequitable outcomes. I'm proud of the Minneapolis Fed for having the foresight to stand up a center to address specific challenges and opportunities presented with the Native American community, to be able to lift up that voice. And I'm really looking forward to our continued work in the future as we expand this. So as I close, I just want to encourage you all, because I know we all come from different walks of life that are listening to this, and I will listen to it in the video, to really take a step back and ask yourself, am I truly listening to the challenges of the people that are diverse? Or is it more of a cosmetic thing where because it's a buzzword, because it's become a thing, now I want to say that we care about diversity? But are you truly listening to understand? Are you truly building relationships? Are you truly trying to understand the structures and the needs of these populations that we're concerned about? Because that's the start of true transformation. And I think you've heard pieces of that coming out of this conversation today. And so with that, I want to help give you an opportunity to reclaim 5 minutes of your time. I gave you 5 minutes back on a happy Friday. We asked a lot of you to do a webinar on Friday, but it was the best time for all our panelists to work out. So again, we appreciate you all. I appreciate the panelists, and I hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you.